All right. I think I got everything. And can you hear me all right? Yeah. All right. So our schedule for the July talks failed to take into account that there were 5 Sundays in July this year instead of 4. So we actually wound up with nobody scheduled to give a talk this morning. So I've gone back to an old paper that I wrote 6 or 7 years ago. And I'm going to talk about the 2 truths. And this kind of gets deep in the weeds a little bit. I'll try not to get too philosophical with it, but when you're talking about truth, you're also talking about the nature of reality and emptiness, and we'll kind of get into those things. So back in the late 80s, I stumbled on my first Thich Nhat Hanh book. It was called Being Peace. And I really liked how he explained the Dharma and the teachings. And I started reading every book by him that I could find. And there were limited numbers of his books out. He hadn't, his publications hadn't exploded like they did later. Anyway, one of the things he talked about was the 2 truths, and he compared it to being a wave on the ocean, that each individual was like a wave and the ocean was the great reality we were all manifestations of. And I thought that was pretty cool. I could go along with that. And some years later, somebody gave me a book by Stephen Batchelor. So, I started reading and listening to his ideas on the Dharma. And he made this statement that he thought the doctrine of the 2 truths is possibly the most problematic development in the history of Buddhism. I mean, whoa. Now, how does that fit in with Thich Nhat Hanh's, 2 truths, the relative and the ultimate, the waves and the ocean? And I used to, start talking about this with individual people and getting into discussions, and they kind of got tired of me doing this and said, write it down. So, I wrote this paper, and I'll try not to read the paper, but I'm going to go over the points in it. And I cleverly named this paper Running on Emptiness. So, after there was that movie Running on Empty with Judd Hirsch, and I always like that. So anyway, Running on Emptiness, a layman's take on the 2 truths. So I'm trying to reconcile Stephen Batchelor's perspective and Thich Nhat Hanh's perspective. Start doing research and looking for the earliest mention of the 2 truths. And the Buddha never mentioned the 2 truths. He never mentioned that doctrine at all. The only time the Buddha talked about truths was whether something you said was true or whether it was false. It was a relative truth. And so where did this come from? If it didn't come from the earliest recording teachings of the Buddha, not just the Pali Canon, but it's not found in the Chinese Agamas, which are the Chinese translations of possibly the same source material in Sanskrit that the Pali Canon was based on. The scholars think that there is a common source material between the Chinese and the Pali Canon. I know there's at least one sutra, the turning of the wheel of Dharma, that his very first doctrine or teaching that he went through. And there's 13 different published versions of that they found historically, and 11 of them are different. And it's kind of interesting to compare that. But anyway, so it's not found in the Nikayas or the Agamas, but at least there was a Mahayana Sutra that I found a reference to, and I'll just read it. It's a little thing. It says, "You, the knower of the world, realize the two levels of reality by yourself, not studying them from others. They are the relative and the ultimate. There is not some third level of reality." Now, that comes from, I think it's a part of the Chinese, because the title is the Pittaputra Samagama Sutra, and it's got the Agama in there, which is the Chinese collection. I've never been able to find a complete translation of that sutra in all my research, but that's the earliest that I found on talking about relative and ultimate. And this could be based on some of the early Abhidharma writings from a century or two after the Buddha's death. But then usually when people talk about the two truths, they quote the earliest mention of it as the the questions of King Milinda. Where are we here? Yes. So this Buddhist text, it's not part of the Pali Canon. It came a little bit later. It's about 100 BCE, which is 2 or 3 centuries after the death of the Buddha. And there's this king, King Milinda, and he's in this discussion with a monk, Nagarjuna. And usually the questions about the two teachings seem to contradict each other. And Nagarjuna tells the king that only the skandhas, the 5 aggregates, are ultimately real, while Nagarjuna, my name, and I, my identity, are only conventionally real. And this doesn't talk about the two truths, but it does talk about conventional reality and ultimate reality. And conventional truth and, ultimate truth are dependent on what is determined to be conventionally real and ultimately real. So the Indian philosophers after the Buddha, there's the well-known Abhidharmas of the I think it's the Theravadins, but there was a bunch of different schools of Buddhism in India that went over what they figured was ultimately real or conventionally real, and it got to be very, very complicated. I want to make one clarification there about our perceptions of reality. And this idea from Ken Wilber, a philosopher, seemed helpful to me. And his view is that everything that we perceive, every phenomena that we perceive, is itself a whole, and it's also a part. It's made up of other wholes. Its parts are other different wholes, and itself as a whole is a part of a greater whole. It's with a W, W-H-O-L-E. So I kind of explain that with the simile of the forest and the trees. So if you look at the forest is the whole. It's part of maybe a larger forest, or it's part of the biology of that area. But then there's the trees, and the trees are the individual reality. And so everything has, what do I say it here, a general aspect, which is the forest, and it has a specific aspect, which is the trees. And so everything that we experience, you can look at it as a general nature, or you can look at it as a specific nature. And that's not the same as ultimate and relative, or ultimate and conventional. These are two different things. All right. So looking at what is real and what isn't real, or what's conventionally real, what's ultimately real, led me to the Indian philosopher Nagarjuna. And he was, what, 500-600 years after the death of the Buddha. And he wrote about this quite a bit. And he starts his arguments by quoting this sutra, the Kachana Gota Sutra, which many of you might be familiar with it, or at least you've heard this part of it. So Kachana comes to the Buddha, and he asks him a question, and the Buddha says, this world, Kachana, for the most part, depends on a duality, upon the notion of it is, and the notion of it is not. But for one who sees with right understanding the arising of the world as it happens, there is no notion of it is not in regard to the world. And one who sees with right understanding the ceasing of the world as it happens, there is no notion of it is in regard to the world. So everything is Kachana. This is one dead end. Everything is not. This is another dead end. Without veering towards either of these dead ends, the Tathagata teaches Dharma by the middle. And Nagarjuna writes in his big long thing, the Mula Madhyama Kakarika. I'll get that out. And this piece writes, the Buddha's teaching of the Dharma is based on two truths, a truth of worldly convention and an ultimate truth. And those who do not understand the distinction drawn between these two truths do not understand the Buddha's profound truth. Without a foundation in the conventional truth, the significance of the ultimate cannot be taught. And without an understanding of the significance of the ultimate, liberation is not achieved. So this is the first time that I saw, the earliest that I saw on using the terms, the two truths. But Nagarjuna's writings, they call them brief, direct, and sometimes cryptic. And there are quite a few arguments on translating and interpreting what Nagarjuna was actually talking about. And this is between the scholars who actually study this stuff for a living. So this led me talking about the nature of conventional reality or ultimate reality. We wound up looking at emptiness and conditioned arising. So we're down into the real basics of things. And by understanding is that all phenomena, everything that we experience, our reality, it's empty of an inherent nature or essence. And so phenomena are not things that we look at, but they're processes that we observe. Even though this desk doesn't look like a process, it actually is. It's aging. There's movement in the atoms. It's not the same as it was 10 years ago. So here's a quote from the Nikayas. Let be the past, Udayan, let be the future. I shall teach you the Dharma. When this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases. And my early books of Thich Nhat Hanh, he called it, this is like this because that is like that. He just boils it down. Everything is in relationship. Nothing is not in relationship with something else. And some of the latest writings on physics claim that reality doesn't exist except when things are in relationship with something else. They just take it right down to atomic particles and things like that. That things seem to disappear because they're not in relationship with anything else. And when they are in relationship, they pop back into reality. They show that protons and particles like that, that's what happens. It's weird. Where am I? So this thing, when this is like this, that is like that, we get into a discussion of causation. If everything is empty, how does it cause something else to happen? And what Nagarjuna is saying, and this took me a while to kind of accept and understand, he's saying that because things are empty, they're always changing. They're not fixed. Every single thing is empty and it's not fixed. And because of this, they don't cause something to happen. They do not have a causal function. But what they are doing is creating the conditions. You create the conditions for change to happen. And this was a kind of a challenging idea for me to get comfortable with. So if you're going to strike a match, am I causing that flame to come into existence? And Nagarjuna's argument is that I am not causing that, but I am creating the exact conditions that allow the flame to arise. And this seems pretty subtle, but it's actually pretty deep. You know, in some 12-step things, they talk about how you just can't decide not to be addicted to something, you know, or you can't decide just to change an ingrained habit. And philosophers talk about free will, that possibly we don't have any free will. We're just victims of all our uncovered biases that are built into us, and whether they're cultural or social or personal, and that we can't help but act in certain ways in certain conditions. It's all kind of determined. And there may be some truth to that, but we do have the freedom to create conditions that allow for change and transition. And this change and transition can just happen on its own. We create the conditions for it, and all of a sudden, well, we feel a little differently. We behave a little differently. Anyway, so causation was a big thing and a hard one to kind of grab a hold of. While there are causes, they are not, they don't determine what's happening. So here's a little. So Nagarjuna says, neither are entities self-caused, nor do they come to be through the power of other entities. That is, there is no causation when causation is thought of as involving causal activity. So this comes from J. Garfield, a Buddhist philosopher and teacher. Nonetheless, he says there are conditions. In fact, Nagarjuna talks about 4 basic conditions that exist. And J. Garfield talks about an example. So you ask the question, why are the lights on? And the first answer could be because I turned the switch. And Nagarjuna says that's an efficient condition. But I could answer because the wires are in good working order, the bulbs haven't burned out, and the electricity is flowing. These are supporting conditions. Or the light is the emission of photons, each of which is emitted in response to the bombardment of an atom by an electron and so forth. That's a chain of immediate conditions. Or the last one is so that we can see. That's why the lights are on. This is a dominant condition. Any of those qualify as conditions, but none of them makes reference to any kind of causal power. So anyway, we get down to Nagarjuna again, and he says, if things did not exist without essence, the phrase, when this exists, so this will be, would not be acceptable. And so what he's saying is, if things were not empty of a fixed essence, a fixed identity, then change would be impossible. And everything is changing, but our perceptions of change make it look to ourselves like things are actually static, that this desk exists and it's a solid thing, and that's it. And this is, I think, our consciousness shorthand for perceiving reality. We need to kind of dumb it down a little bit to be able to handle all the input. So Thich Nhat Hanh talks about the chair is made up of non-chair elements. Or he talks about the clouds, anything. And the self is made up of non-self elements. The chair and the self are inter-are with all things. He calls this inner being, and I'm going to refer to it as conditionality. Anything with an inherent nature would exist solely because of that nature, and that nature would be fixed and unchanging. Because of it being fixed and unchanging, it would be unable to generate something outside of itself, as that would entail change. It would not be dependent on conditioned arising, and that, argues Nagarjuna, would be impossible. He says, if the existence of all things is perceived in terms of their essence, then this perception of all things will be without the perception of causes and conditions. And in the first little quote from Nagarjuna, it talked about the truth of worldly conditions, or the truth of worldly convention. So now we're getting into conventional reality. And so I was curious as to what they actually talk about as a convention. So they're saying language is a convention. It's an agreed upon thing. Money is a convention. It's an agreed upon thing. Social customs are all conventions. And conventions can be either tacit or explicit. A couple of definitions from the dictionary is general agreement on or acceptance of certain practices or attitudes. By convention, north is at the top of a map. A practice or procedure widely observed in a group, especially to facilitate social interaction. A custom, the convention of shaking hands. A general agreement about basic principles or procedures, as in science or justice. A principle or procedure accepted as true or correct by convention. So Nagarjuna continues, whatever is dependently co-arisen, that is explained to be emptiness. That, being a dependent designation, is itself the middle way. Something that is not dependently arisen, such a thing does not exist. Therefore, a non-empty thing does not exist. So there we are with emptiness. And we're talking about conventional reality. And if conventional reality only contains the phenomena that are dependently arisen, and if our feelings and thoughts about these phenomena are also dependently arisen, then conventional truth would be everything without exception arises and passes away dependent on conditions and is thus empty of any inherent nature. Well, if we accept that as conventional reality or a conventional truth, then what is the ultimate truth? Phenomena are empty of something. They did not emerge out of something called emptiness. I've seen emptiness referred to with the term voidness. I've also seen it said that all things arise out of emptiness, sometimes called an unconditioned void of potential, or just the unconditioned. But that is not what the Buddha seems to have meant when he explained the unconditioned. So here's from the Samyutta Nikaya. And what, monks, is the unconditioned? The ending of desire, the ending of hatred, the ending of delusion. This is called the unconditioned. So the Buddha employs one of his little teaching techniques, and he takes a well-known term at the time and he turns it on its head. In the Brahminical thought at the time, becoming one with the unconditioned was the highest aspiration. But the Buddha takes a noun, the unconditioned, and turns it into a verb. And the unconditioned then becomes to be unconditioned by desire, hatred, and delusion, which is a different thing entirely, seeing that as a verb instead of a noun. In English, we have an abundance of nouns. English is known for being noun-heavy language. We like to name things and see them as themselves. Again, emptiness is not a thing. It's something that phenomena can arise. It is not something that a phenomena can arise out of like waves on the ocean. That would be a reification of emptiness and turn emptiness into something eternal. And Nagarjuna's argument is that there is nothing eternal, that we can't know anything that is eternal. And so this whole thing about emptiness, the scholars say that the only reason they came up with the concept of emptiness was to counteract the idea of, it's hard to pronounce, svabha. All right, that's the Sanskrit, or essence. So if we didn't assign an identity or an essence to the phenomena that we perceive, and we do this erroneously, in error, we wouldn't need to talk about essence or emptiness. And emptiness only came along to refute this idea of identity in phenomena. It's not a thing in itself. It was just an argument to be used to stop our misperception of how we see reality. So I'm running a little overboard here, so what the argument is then is that if the only things we can know are conventional truths, and the only thing we perceive is conventional reality, Nagarjuna's conclusion is that the ultimate truth or the ultimate reality is that there is only conventional truth, that there is only conventional reality. We are not in any way capable of perceiving something like that. And Nagarjuna is saying that basically it doesn't make any sense to think that it might exist, because it wouldn't be empty, it would be fixed. Ultimate truth would be unchanging. It would always be there. And so what the philosophers and the scientists are telling us, that is wrong, that everything is changing. And we can only know our reality partially. We're never going to get the whole picture. So one of the ways I was going to illustrate our consciousness provides us with a first-person perspective on our experience. And we rely on that as an accurate picture of our reality. But in truth, it's not. It's not at all. You know, if you see the color blue, like Mary's shirt, that doesn't exist in reality. All it is are certain wavelengths of energy. Our optic nerve brings that in, translates it, and our consciousness makes sense of perceiving these wavelengths as the color blue. And it doesn't mean that the color blue isn't real, but it's a representation of our experience of reality. And just because it's a representation of our experience doesn't mean that it's not real. But it is our perception. It is not reality. It is our perception of our experience. So the Buddha got asked famously he kept getting asked about these questions on the nature of reality. The monks were interested. And it turned out that there were 10 things that he would not give answers to. And here they are. I will find it here. Why did I not find it? I find anyway. Oh, here they are, right in front of me. So the big questions, and these were apparently hot issues at the time of the Buddha. Is the cosmos eternal? Is it not eternal? Is it finite or is it infinite? Is the body is the same as the soul? Is the body one thing and the soul another? Does the Tathagata exist after death? Does he not exist after death? Does he both exist and not exist? Or does he neither exist or not exist? And the Buddha says he wouldn't answer those questions because, in his words, it's a thicket of views, a wilderness of views, a contortion of views, a writhing of views, a fetter of views. It is accompanied by suffering, distress, despair, and fever. It does not lead to disenchantment, dispassion, cessation, to calm, direct knowledge, full awakening, and unbinding. So, and that's what the Evyakata Samutta. Anyway, that's in Access to Insight. You can find those if you want. And this kind of brings to mind, the story of the parable of the arrow, where the guy gets shot by an arrow, a poisoned arrow, and the doctor wants to remove it, and the guy says, "No, not until you tell me who shot it. What kind of poison is it? What kind of arrow was it? What kind of feathers were on it? All of that stuff he wanted to know before he would let the doctor remove the arrow. And of course, he dies before he gets any answers to those questions. And the Buddha was saying that what's the point of those questions? They don't lead to the end of suffering. So I'll try and wrap things up here. Buddha, I always see him as a pragmatist. He wasn't interested in the nature of reality. He wasn't interested in what ultimate truths were or anything like that. He offered us something to do and to see for ourselves whether it was helpful. He doesn't seem very concerned about truth or any of that. They often refer to him as the great physician, offering treatments for our existential condition. And our existential condition is dukkha. This is dukkha. Birth is dukkha. Aging is dukkha. Sickness is dukkha. Death is dukkha. Encountering what is not dear is dukkha. Separation from what is dear is dukkha. Not getting what one wants is dukkha. This psychophysical condition is dukkha. That comes out of the Mahavagga, which is part of the Vinaya, Theravada Vinaya, if you want to try and find it. So we live in an ever-changing, conditional reality. And there's basically two things that we really, really know for sure. And the first of those is that we were born. But we don't know why. We're here. We don't know why we're here. We're just here. to take part in it. And the second thing we know is that we will die, but we don't know when. So we've got two big unanswerable questions there. And that's dukkha in itself, right into the foundations. And we're all burning with the three fires of greed, anger, and ignorance. And we're all subject to old age, sickness, and death. And because the reality that we're in is ever changing, we can never really know anything completely. Everything is more complicated than it appears to be. There's always another aspect that we don't take into consideration. We can't take everything into consideration. So we don't know anything completely, but balancing all that out is that things are empty and they arise conditionally and they pass away. And if that wasn't the case, we would be incapable of change and growth. So, my original thing of trying to determine what is true was probably not the most important question. The big question is whether we can determine a reality beyond the one we perceive. And my conclusion is that we have no way of knowing a reality beyond our perception. It's speculation, projection, and a lot of wishful thinking about where there is. But there's still a widespread belief in the existence of a greater reality. And it's based on a teaching or a spiritual experience or an intuition or just a yearning. And it may feel entirely justified and right and true. And I would call that faith. And I believe the faith in that view is sincere. However, what I found in the teachings of Buddha and Nagarjuna has led me to have faith in another view, that we're beings in a conditional reality and therefore are unable to have knowledge of anything beyond this reality. And if we let go of ideas of larger truths and deeper realities, all we are left with is this reality in which nothing can be found to have any essential nature. And any knowledge we have is conditional and framed by our conventions. So I go back to when I thought that I was a wave on the ocean of ultimate reality. And it was a very comforting thought for me. I welcomed that illusion. But the real miracle is not some eternal all. The real miracle is just that we exist at all. And in such richness, our existence is. How is it that I am here speaking to you? Fortunately, due to our conditional reality being empty, we have in this very life the capability as well as the freedom to change, develop, and experience some awakening. And that is really most sufficient. So that is the end. And I'm wondering if anybody has any comments. Tim, can you go ahead and unmute yourself?
I am unmuted.
All right.
So 3 things here. I'll try and not take up too much time, but
all right.
First, thanks for being Johnny on the spot and giving this great talk. 31 days in July, who would have known? Why are we the last to know?
Yeah.
Second, I'd like, and you've done this before in your talks, bringing, with Zen, sometimes we talk so much about what teachers have said. We don't talk as much about what the Buddha said. And you mentioned that the Buddha never talked about the two truths, and that's news to me. I didn't not think he did or didn't. I hadn't never thought about it, but I like that you bring that into talks. I know there's a prior talk where, unless I'm forgetting this and misremembering, but that the Buddha never said that the self does not exist. What he actually said was that no matter where you look for the self, you cannot find it.
Exactly.
It's a very nice distinctions sometimes that are very clear and short and to the point. When you take a specific quote from the Buddha, that puts a whole different perspective on some of our Zen practice. And the third thing, I really liked your image you gave that when talking about like looking at a table, it looks, solid. Of course, it's changing all the time, but that's our way that our mind dumbs things down in order to take in all the input coming in. And I thought that that's an interesting analogy, because if you actually could see everything changing all the time, it might be overwhelming. And I also thought it was useful because sometimes a person can talk about Buddhist ideas of everything's always changing to someone that's not Buddhist, and they'll be like, well, yeah, that's obvious. We're always changing and whatever. But then they leave that conversation and they totally 100% buy into the dumbed down process, clinging to views, labeling people certain things. And you can come back and say, but everyone's always changing. They'll go, yeah, I know everything's always changing. Everybody knows that. And then they'll just dive back into the dumbed down process. And that's really anyway. So I like that whole image that you gave. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Anyone else? Ryushin.
So every year, Upaya has this Varilla Symposium with Evan Thompson and John Dunn and a lot of other big names. And the last few years, they've included an astrophysicist named Adam Frank. And Evan Thompson and Adam Frank are going to be putting out a book. And Adam Frank explained the history of physics in his little talk. And basically, he said, as you did, that everything is in relation. He said, there are no properties. Everything is in relation. And conventionally, we're always dealing with things dumbed down as properties. But there are no properties. Otherwise, as you say, things wouldn't be able to change. If things had properties, those properties would tend to be fixed, and they're not fixed. Everything is in relation. And one of the more startling things he said was that, yes, there is a world out there, but it's not this one. It's not the one that we experience. There's something out there, but it's not what we're experiencing. So it is difficult to live with thinking that everything is in relation, but it really does kind of open things up, that you see how people react in different situations around different people, around different set of circumstances. Everything is in relation. And even physicists say it as far as trying to measure things. They can only measure things in relation to other things, even as much as a ruler. We think an inch is an inch, but that's not always. An inch is not. An inch itself is in relation. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Thanks. I've listened to not the last couple of years, but for quite a few years, I listened to those symposiums at Upaya with Evan Thompson and John Dunn. And I saw a teaching from John Dunn, and he made a statement. I think he was down at Upaya. He was there for a while in residence, and he made a statement that there is no such thing as non-contextual truth. That every truth has a context because it's a process and it's in relationship with other things. So I've always liked that. No such thing as non-contextual truth. And I have come to appreciate context to a much greater degree.
Yeah, the whole teaching of Francisco Varela and Evan Thompson and their other collaborator is that you basically are enacting the path as you walk the path. You are creating the world as you engage in the world. There's no, as you say, there's nothing else. There's nothing else going on.
Anybody else? All right, well, we're going to wrap this up here. Next week, Ryushin is scheduled to give a talk. Did you realize that? You're on the schedule. Yeah, okay, good. So we've got that squared away. Well, we got the community weekend happening down at Hokyoji next weekend. That ought to be fun. We've got two new residential staff people, Bo and Alex, that are coming to Hokyoji for fairly long stays. We'll see how that goes. I'm looking forward to it. And we do have the Jewel Mirror session in August on, what is it, 22nd, 23rd, something like that. If 16th, it's like the third week in August. I think that's Jewel Mirror. And that's with Dokai and Raymond Gumbel from Milwaukee and Dagako Rume from St. Louis. That should be an interesting time. I think that's all I have. So we can recite the 4 vows together and call it a day. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are. I vow to avoid delusions. My brain is occupied by trying to get my talk together here. Dharma gates are boundless, and I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Thanks, Carl.
All right.